I've never liked the Clone Wars cartoon series. In the original version, which was an actual cartoon, as in drawn by hand, the animations were poor, it looked cheap and nasty, Anakin whined like a little baby bitch, the plot was mediocre at best, and it directly contradicted events that had already been established in the extended universe, something George Lucas was notorious for doing. However, it was important for two things. In the second season, it introduced the world to General Grievous before Revenge of the Sith aired at Pictures in 2005, and in the first season we were introduced to a brand new character in the form of Asajj Ventress, as she made her very first appearance in the Star Wars universe. 3 years later we got the Clone Wars movie and the series that followed it, and I didn't like that either. The CGI was excellent though. I particularly enjoyed the way the animators added the texture of brushstrokes on objects, something I found most easily seen on the Clone Troopers' armour, and it's something I wish had been carried over to Rebels. That little touch just made the world feel that much more alive. Unfortunately, it was of course based on the prequels, and while I honestly tried to enjoy it, it had all the hang-ups and negatives that plagued the prequels, so I just found it bland, and yet again, under George Lucas's direction, it directly contradicted the previously established events in the extended universe. Before reading Dark Disciple, I decided to watch the Clone Wars again because I couldn't remember how Asajj Ventress and Quinlan Voss's stories ended in the show, and anytime I searched for a history of either of them after the book was released, everyone had updated their videos and Wikipedia to include the events of Dark Disciple. Obviously, if I was going to get the most out of the book, I wouldn't want to be told the story before I read the book, so the only choice I had was to watch all 6 seasons again. It wasn't fun the second time round either. I think the worst part was when there were 5 or 6 episodes back to back telling the story of how R2 and a few droids got lost in an unknown section of space, ended up finding an amnesiac clone trooper and hijacking a Star Destroyer back to known space. It was just painful. The amount of filler on that show combined with the less than Star Warsy feel made the whole thing a chore, but I was genuinely curious about this book. While this isn't a review of the Clone Wars, the reason I'm saying this is so you have some kind of context as to how I feel about that general era, and particularly the show Dark Disciple is based on. Except for Ahsoka's final story arc, which was the only time anyone on the show actually showed the ability to grow as a character, I hated it. I hated it all. From the movie to the end, I hated it all. Which is why when I read Dark Disciple, I was quite surprised. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Dark Disciple is based on 8 unused episodes of the Clone Wars that would have featured as a single arc at the end of Season 6 and the beginning of Season 7. It's part of the Clone Wars Legacy project which, along with Ahsoka, the Darth Maul Son of Dathomir comic and a few storyboards, tells the story of what would have been the rest of the Clone Wars series. I like that Disney are wrapping stuff up rather than leaving fans hanging. We as people who invest our time and money in Star Wars deserve to have an end to the show. As I said, I'm not a fan of the show, but I like to keep up with the canon, and that means the Clone Wars too, so I expect an end to the overall story. This is one of those ends. This was my first time reading anything by Christie Golden, and I really did enjoy it. However, I'm not really sure how much work she really had to do here. The episodes were already written and laid out in order for her, all she had to do was convert it from script and storyboard form into a novel. I'm not trying to take anything away from her, I'm just not sure how much is Christie Golden and how much is the writers of the Clone Wars. You can tell where the episodes join together in the book, and this is the only bad thing I have to say about Dark Disciple. It's very fast paced, because for a book with about 330 pages, fitting 8 episodes in means on average each episode gets 40 pages. So 1 minute Ventress is here, the next minute Quinlan is there, then 2 pages later everybody's on a completely different planet. It's very fast paced to the point where it makes you aware that it's not one coherent story, it's 8 parts of a story in one. But it didn't detract from the story. If anything, this is the fastest pace the Clone Wars has ever gone at, and it works a hell of a lot better than the show ever did, but compared to a normal Star Wars novel, the edges of the episodes are just a bit obvious. The characters were written perfectly. Whenever Obi-Wan, Mace Windu or Count Dooku spoke, I could hear the cast of the show in my head delivering the lines, and that made it very immersive. I like being able to know what a character sounds like when I'm reading a book, because it just helps draw me in that bit more than if I otherwise didn't. Obi-Wan in particular had a few lines near the beginning where he's trying to teach Quinlan how to interact with Ventress, and while it was funny, it actually made me think back to watching the show and gave me a slightly different perspective of what I'd seen. I also enjoyed the cat and mouse games being played between Ventress and Quinlan, Ventress, Quinlan and the Council, Dooku and Ventress Ventress, Quinlan and Dooku. There's lots of little webs connecting all the characters in this book, and it adds a little layer of mystery about exactly who is being honest and who is being deceptive, and because this is set not long before Revenge of the Sith, the dark side clouds everything, so no one can really tell, and it keeps you guessing. The way Quinlan Vos was portrayed in the Clone Wars was generally happy-go-lucky but with a dark streak, and he's just like that here. This is so much better than the Quinlan Vos in the old extended universe. I could never get to the bottom of that guy's story. There was always a hint in this comic, and then a little bit of a tease in that comic, and unless you knew exactly where to look, or had enough money to buy every Star Wars comic, you could quite easily end up knowing of him, and about him, but not what his actual deal was. Like I did, and what I was left with, in this case, was this emo Jedi who was sulky, but I never knew why, because his deal was never presented to me in one go. And when that happens, and you get a Jedi who appears sulky for no other reason than to be sulky, it seems more like a marketing ploy aimed at teenagers than an interesting character. I was a teenager back then and I still didn't care for Quinlan Vos, but at least within the Clone Wars and Dark Disciple they've kind of channeled the spirit of the old Quinlan, but given him a proper uncomplicated plot and presented him in a more direct way, which makes it a lot easier to understand and appreciate his character, and as a reader I appreciate being able to understand the character I'm reading about without having to go hunting through 1,000,001 comics to find out why Quinlan has that streak to him. Overall, Dark Disciple was a fun book, and I never thought I would say those words about anything that came from the Clone Wars, but it's actually the second time I've said that about an offshoot, because I also enjoyed Ahsoka. I think Dark Disciple is a better book than Ahsoka, but I think Ahsoka added more lore, particularly with the lightsaber crystals and the bleeding of the crystals, but they both have merit in their own way. But if I could only ever read one again, it would have to be Dark Disciple. It's just a bit more fun. I'd like to see one more book now. We've had Dark Disciple telling us how the Clone Wars ends for Quinlan and Ventress. We've had Sons of Dathomir telling us how Maul dealt with Sidious after being captured in the show, and we've had Ahsoka a year after the events of Revenge of the Sith. And while it's been mentioned in one episode of Rebels and in the prologue of Ahsoka, we've never really had an end of the war for Ahsoka, Rex, Maul and Mandalore presented to us in a consumable manner. I know what happened, but I don't want to just experience it from storyboards, I want to read it. If they do that the way they did Dark Disciple and wrap it up, as far as I'm concerned, that is the end of the Clone Wars, not only finished but wrapped up nicely rather than just left hanging. I doubt they will, since it's been so long since the end of the Clone Wars, but that would just be the perfect way to end the story for me. I definitely recommend Dark Disciple, especially if you are a fan of the Clone Wars. It's a good book, it's fun, it's not too heavy, it's not too light either, it's fun.